Welcome to the State of the Program, brought to you by our friend Adam Lowy over at the Lowy Law Firm. I'm Bobby Burton, joined by CJ Vogel. Jerry Hamilton is out and about on recruiting duties today in the state of Florida, which we will talk about a little bit in the State of the Program. But CJ, one of the things that you and I wanted to get to today actually was talking about where we're at 8 games into this season. That's 2/3 of the regular season now complete. And maybe do a little overview of the positives that we've seen, along with some stats that kind of back that up, as well as some negatives that we've seen with some stats that back that up. Before we get to that, though, let's talk about injuries and where the team is overall. All in all, a very healthy season for Texas. Right now, based on where they started the season to today, I'm not talking about preseason where they lost Cedric Baxter. But Texas has only lost one full-time starter from the beginning of the season, and that's for the rest of the season, and that is Derek Williams, the defensive back safety. So all in all, of the starting 22, Texas 8 games or 2/3 of the year into it, up overall, are down only just one, which if you look around the country, that actually is really, really good.
It's quite surprising to sit here, 10 weeks into the year and say Texas is a healthy football team, given what happened before the season even started, right? And, I know CJ Baxter is still lost, and his absence is still felt with this offense. But throughout the rest of that offense, very healthy, right? Isaiah Bond missed a game. He's expected back for Florida. This bye week comes at a great time for him. He had a bit of a bum ankle and was able to give it a go against Georgia. He obviously wasn't 100%. And Texas, again, wanted to get him fully healthy for that final regular season phase coming up. Same situation with Andrew Makuba, who we expect back for Florida as well. And again, very fortunate for those that rewatched his injury or saw it live that he's not a guy on the shelf with Derek Williams for the rest of the year. So Texas, again, defensively, very healthy in the sense that only one true guy that has contributed each week or is expected to contribute the rest of the year is sidelined. And a positive note in that regard is Jelani McDonald stepped in tremendously, and it almost felt like a seamless transition from one safety to the next, even with a few on the bench with an injury.
Yeah, McDonald may have also felt really good because he was going up against a running first team, whereas Makuba may be better in pass coverage because of his experience at this point. But what I wanted to say is it's not just been of late that Texas has been healthy all year. I mean, Quinn missed a couple games, right? Isaiah Bonds now missed a game. We talked about Derek Williams going to be out the rest of the year. Makuba. Other than that, no starter has really missed a game. There's been a little bit of a carousel at running back where Jaden Blue took a game off, then Trey Weiser took a game off. But by and large, the Longhorns have escaped the true, getting down to the nitty gritty. Maybe a little bit at running back there was hit or miss. When they both had ankle injuries. But now, with the last part of the season ready to go, Texas, thankfully, knock on wood, okay right now at overall on injuries. So that let's go out of injuries, and let's talk about positives and negatives. Let's start with the positives on this team. You and I talked beforehand. The things that we wanted to mention are this: individual defensive playmaking along with the defense as a whole. This defense is seeing playmakers emerge, and they're seeing results of being a cohesive unit overall. They are second in the country in points allowed per game at 11.5 points per game. That is just absolutely crazy. You wanted to call out the actual individual defensive playmaking as part of that. And what did you want to talk about that in your piece here, CJ?
Yeah, I think there's part of this Texas defense where individual playmakers can take over full games for this defense, right? Michael Taft had a pick, a forced fumble, and a PBU in the end zone against Vanderbilt. You look at what Anthony Hill was able to do against Oklahoma in Dallas, and I mean, there's no telling what he can do once he gets to the upperclassman stage of his career. I mean, guys are taking over football games and doing so very well. Jahdae Barron, 2 interceptions. And these guys they're winning, being recognized. They're being honored by the SEC for their performances. It's a holistic approach. Yes, Texas has a very good defense, right? You mentioned second in the country in terms of points per allowed per game. That's great. But when you have those game breakers that teams have to focus on and game plan against, it gets really difficult. And even in the stat sheet for the sacks that aren't showing up, you're seeing Vernon Broughton, you're seeing Alfred Collins be disrupted. Jermaine Lole coming off of his best 2 games as a Longhorn as well. Trey Moore, a big-time incompletion on 3rd down with Vanderbilt backed up against their own end zone. Ethan Burke, get a hand up, bat the ball up, you get an interception, right? It's little things like that, yes, you're in the right position, you're playing sound football, but it's the little instinctual plays that take it from being a team effort, a team, kind of just doing your job to doing a little bit more of a special game-changing instance there. And that's where I stand. I really stand with this defense because it's been madly impressive so far this year, Bobby.
Yeah, you add guys like Colin Simmons in that infinite playmaker, but really it's been not the flashy playmakers that I think have been so strong about this defense. It's been guys like Baron Sorrell, right?
Yeah.
Like frankly, an Andrew Makuba or a Michael Taff or a Leonga Lafau or Jermaine Lole, and the depth that they've had that has made them so sparkling. I mean, I really believe that has been a piece of it, is not just the playmakers, but it's not just it's not a Texas defense, and this goes way back before your time, but Texas during John Malkovich had a player named Tony Brackens that was a first-round draft pick, caused all kinds of holy you-know-what on opposing teams. I mean, really was one of the best pass rushers ever at Texas. Well, I'm not saying he was a one-man warrior, but he didn't have a great defense around him with a lot of the pieces. I think this unit, to your point, has that individual playmaker component. They also have the team around it and the unit. And I look, 2nd in the country in points allowed per game. I don't care who you're playing. I really don't. I mean, that's just a tremendous place where Texas has come. And I will say this till time and time again. Pete Kwiatkowski took over a defense that was in horrible shape. And we look 4 years later and they're 2nd in the country in points per game. I don't know that even the staunchest Texas fans would have expected that from Pete Kwiatkowski after year 1 when Texas went 5-7 and got rolled in a lot of second halves. So I absolutely think that's one of the biggest positives. I think the other one, just from a stat perspective, and this is the simplest stat of all, 7-1. I mean, you can talk about whether or not the punt game is doing well and some other aspects of offense, et cetera. But 7-1 is meaningful. It puts Texas everywhere it wants to be going forward. All right, let's before we look at some of the negatives and things we want to discuss as it relates to that, I want to say thank you to our sponsor. That's Adam Lowy and the Lowy Law Firm. Each and every day of the program brought to you by Adam and his group. 20-plus years of experience helping injured Texans. So if you've been injured in a car wreck, truck wreck, automobile accident of any kind, including an 18-wheeler or even an ATV, and think you might be due some level of compensation, give Adam and his firm a call. Reach out to him at loweylawfirm.com. They have a no-strings-attached consultation that they'll do for you. Again, loweylawfirm.com. Thanks, Adam, for your sponsorship. All right, negatives. And you and I talked about this as well, CJ. Pass protection, Quinn's injury, making whether that breeded or brought about a regression of sorts. But there's some numbers behind this that are particularly concerning. So take away how you feel anecdotally, right, about it. 2 big stat concerns on offense right now. Giving up 2.1 sacks per game, okay, and at number 71 in the country. That's not an offense that is really kicking on all gears. And then here's another big one that Sark has got to be concerned with. Texas right now, 110th in the country in turnovers given up. They're giving up 1.8 turnovers per game. That is not sustainable of an elite team. What do you make of that? The sack, pass protection, and then the turnovers, whether it's been fumbles or Quinn's thrown a few interceptions this year.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll start with the offensive line because I think that's one of the more surprising situations, right? Especially the last 2 games, Texas allowed 11 sacks. If you add Oklahoma in there, Texas allowing 4 sacks per game over its last 3 contests, and stack that up with where that ranks nationally, and you're 130th. So, they played well in the first half, right? And then you start playing some SEC caliber teams, and those numbers start to look a little bit worse. And that's very concerning, and it's not just getting beat one-on-one because that happens in football, but it's the miscommunications. It's the tight ends not blocking their guys, the running backs missing where they're supposed to be in pass protection as well. Pass protection is an entire group. And you can even throw Quinn Ewers in there for not getting the ball out at times, right? It's a holistic approach of either taking no gain with a throwaway, taking positive yards with the check down, turning that into a 6, 7, 8 yard loss, and potential forced fumble on a sack that, we saw against Georgia that set up a 13-yard touchdown drive, right? It's little things that certainly helped keep Texas out of the end zone in the second half against Vanderbilt, is that negative play, that lack of complementary football on the offensive side, but it's got to get better. And you have a great opportunity to play some talented edge rushers, some talented fronts over the next 4 weeks before the postseason arrives. And that has to get better 100%. But with Quinn and what's next for him, I mean, it's taking that step, right? You're the quarterback. Diagnose, getting communication with Jake Majors. You got an experienced offensive line. This is all about communication at that offensive line because you got some talented guys, right? Kelvin Banks going to be a pro. Jake Majors going to be a pro. You looked at right tackle Cam Williams as a guy that was expected to be a pro as well. This has to be a part of this offense that takes the next step. Whereas turnovers again, and you look at where Texas loses all of their football games, Bobby. Last 2 years, Oklahoma, you had 4 turnovers. Washington, you had 2 costly fumbles, one going into your red zone, one coming out. And then again against Georgia, 3 forced fumbles and an interception. You can't turn the ball over against good football teams. And we've seen what Texas can do defensively when given the opportunity to have a long field. Here's one more stat for you. I love points per drive given up on defenses. That's how I evaluate defenses. How talented are you? I know points per game can be a bit misleading, but when you have 20 defensive drives, you're bound to give up some points. Texas is the number 1 defense in the country when giving up points defensively on a long field and a medium field. That means 60 yards and 80 yards to go. When they have a possession that starts at midfield or in, they're 35th. So that kind of gives you a little understanding of where this defense can and will be for the remainder of the year when given field space to work with defensively. Otherwise, 35th is good. It's not elite. Not being elite defensively isn't going to win you a national championship.
Yeah, I tell you what, that the stat you just gave me about turnovers and remembering those games, that Texas hasn't lost many games the last 2 years.
Exactly.
They really haven't. And when you talk about the 3 that they have lost, turnovers played a huge role. All right, a couple other positives that we really didn't get to that I think are necessary. Here's a stat for you, CJ. Texas is one of 7 teams right now who are in the top 20 on both offense and defense overall. They join Army, Ohio State, and then 4 other SEC teams: Tennessee, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M. That is pretty strong company. Again, 7 teams are in both the top 20 in offense and defense. Texas is one of those. Here's another aspect, another stat that I think is huge. Texas right now ranked 3rd in the country on offense. This is a Steve Sarkisian specialty. 3rd in the country on offense in plays of 20 yards or more, CJ. So there have been 8 games, right? Texas played 8 games. How many 20-plus yards per plays per game is Texas averaging?
It's a pretty significant margin, right? It's about
I'll tell you right now what it is. It's 8+. All right, 7+ 20-yard plays per game. That's 140 yards easily just off of explosives. That's a huge, huge figure. 3rd in the country, Texas is, in 20+ yards per play, or 20-yard plays. That's just big. So those kind of stats are meaningful to me because it shows you can strike quickly and or eat up chunk yardage. Right now, Texas 3rd in the country there. The other thing I want to say, and this, we talked about the players that were the solid players on defense, in the Baron Sorrells, the Leon Fowles, David Bendas, those kind of guys that have been just solid players all along. I'm going to add these guys to that on offense: Gunnar Helm, Juan Davis, Matthew Golden, and DeAndre Moore.
Absolutely.
Okay. Those guys have done everything, in my opinion, with their opportunities. I can't remember a drop from DeAndre Moore. I can't remember a drop from Matthew Golden. And I know that they're working hard in the run game. And then Gunnar Helm and Juan Davis have done more than anticipated for this team. And so there's a lot of positives I'm mixing in here. There are a few negatives as well. But, Texas is 7-1, and they've got some teams coming up on their schedule. It's the meat of the SEC schedule. Anything you want to say overall for the first 2/3 of this season that have gone by that have surprised you, or pleasantly or negatively?
Yeah, I think just offensively, you look at what's happened the last 3 games with Quinn coming back. I'd be remiss to not call it a rut. It has been a rut. Turnovers have been killer. Offensive line's not been great. Protection, whatever you want to call it, it's not been what Texas fans and what we have expected, having watched and followed this team since the spring, right? That's supposed to be what drives this team. The one silver lining I see is, again, that defense is as good, if not better, than everybody in the country. I think it is absolutely an elite defense, and when you play complementary football, teams are not going to score more than 20 points on you if they have to drive the length of the field. We've seen that every single week this season. With that said, the silver lining for me is if this offense finds what it is looking for currently, and it's just that consistency to move the football, to punt the ball after failed drives, to not shoot itself in the foot in second halves, you're going to return to the level of football that Texas fans expected, the one that we saw the first 3 weeks of the season with a healthy Quinn Ewers, right? And that's one that scores points, moves the football, and plays tremendous lockdown defense on the opposite side. And that's what you want, right? So you have 4 opportunities to get back to that, really 3, because I think that A&M game is going to be the one that you look at and say you have to be at your best to win this game on the road, But to go into the postseason, if you can find just that little bit of consistency offensively, you're going to be back to where you wanted to be.
Turnovers have to stop.
That's it.
That is the recipe, because that's what creates the short fields. That maybe perhaps poor punting at times, but turnovers cause real issues for this Texas defense. To your point, only number 35 in the country on short fields, whereas number 1 in the country on both long and medium fields. That tells you a lot about PK's defense. All right, let's talk a little bit about recruiting here. I think these are important times. Obviously, we're closing in on the end of the 2025 recruiting class. Signing day coming up December 4th, or signing week, whatever we want to call it these days. It's really interesting to me, CJ. Texas really only has one guy in the state right now that they're definitely going to have an opportunity to get, and that's Michael Terry out of San Antonio. Yes, they're recruiting Dorian Brew and Cortland Guillory and Kelshawn Johnson and even Chase Sims. Those are defensive backs, wide receiver, and a defensive lineman all together, all committed elsewhere. But there's not many open players out there right now for Texas in the state of Texas. The vast majority of what they're doing actually is in Florida and Georgia. I mean, they are still in on 4 defensive linemen in Georgia alone. They're in on a new linebacker in Florida that Jerry's going to see today in Kellen Wiley at Sefner Armwood. They've also recruiting Javion Hilson, the defensive end out of Florida. That looks like a race between Texas and Texas A&M. What do you make of this, where Texas has kind of figured out what they're doing in state with a couple of balls? They're juggling a couple balls in the air there, but really the last month of the season, it feels like, or 35 days before signing day, it feels like they're going to be spending most of their time in Georgia and Florida.
Yeah, it's new, right? This hasn't been the recruiting of Texas as old, but I love it, because I think what Texas does, and they've done this over the last couple of cycles, is they get really talented players. Their top list guys from the in-state of Texas, and that's not to take away from anybody, but then they go big game hunting for some of these guys on a national perspective, and that's out of Florida, that's out of Georgia. Hasn't been as active out of California, but Texas will absolutely have a footprint, out west again in future cycles. But that's what helps you stack great big-time talent, right? You can look at the edge room specifically, right? Lance Jackson, Smith Orogbo, two really, really, really talented edge rushers. But when a guy like Javion Hilson comes available and is interested, you don't say no. And if you can add a third to that group goes from being really, really darn good to being one of the best, if not the best in the country for a single haul. And that's how you start to stack. And that's how you start to separate yourself in the trenches at the edge room. And so that's very encouraging. Defensive line, again, we knew coming into this cycle that it was going to be a tough cycle for Kenny Baker in the state of Texas, right? He came in a little bit late, didn't have the relationships previously, and it just wasn't, frankly, a good class in the state of Texas for the defensive linemen. So you work around, you try to go in and try to flip a Chase Sims, and Texas still might. But then you start looking at Florida and Georgia, where these guys are produced more than the average per capita in any other state across the country, and you're going to find a Kevin Wynn. You're going to land a Myron Charles. Again, Texas has a foothold up in California, so you can pull in a Josiah Sharma, but then a Joseph Mbaktu becomes available, and you're sitting there thinking, okay, this went from being a question mark in June and July to, oh, wow, we're sitting here a month from signing day, Bobby, thinking this Texas defensive line class could be one of the better ones that Texas has brought in recent memory. So that's where I start to think is the new territory brings new light. When you're winning like Texas is, and I know there's plenty to improve on, but when you're 7-1, you're top 10 in the country, things are going to start looking up nationally. And Texas will become one of those cool schools again, and you're seeing it with all this interest from the Southeast.
Yeah, I wonder what this portends for future years. That's my question. Is this a SEC move to tap into Georgia and Florida? It feels like it's not. They've been dealing and dipping their toe into Florida for a while. We've mentioned that before with Cedric Baxter, Jarrett Gibson, those guys. But Emory Winston, the tight end out of Georgia, committed early last year. They got a quarterback out of Mobile, Alabama, in 2025. Then they also have a quarterback out of South Florida in 2026. It feels like it's definitely part of Sark's thought process to kind of move in a little bit on that SEC realm.
Yes.
A little bit more, not just in Louisiana, which is a neighboring state, but across the entire SEC.
And can I ask you this, because you've followed this recruiting world a little bit longer than I have here, but
a little bit.
I had an issue with Texas under a few staffs previously. They like to recruit nationally. Texas is a big brand. You can recruit nationally, but when you don't take care of your backyard, and you don't win those big recruiting, battles out wide outside the state lines, then you're fighting from behind 2 8 balls.
Yep.
Texas, to me, still takes care of its backyard, right? When these coaches go on the road, their first stops are always Austin. Then they expand to San Antonio and Waco and the central Austin, and then they go to Dallas and Houston. So my question is, do you still feel like Texas is doing enough inside the state lines to take care of its backyard per se before then going out and trying to fight some of these big-time national battles?
Yeah, in East Texas too. Yes, I do. And here's why. I think that Mac Brown, for example, wanted to get 95% of his class, if not 100, from the state of Texas. The problem with that is if you're really an elite program, there may really only be 20 to 25 guys in the state of Texas you really want. Mm-hmm. And there may be only 15 to 25 of those guys in Georgia and Florida too. Okay. And what I think Sark has done is, okay, I'm not going to go unless I really think this guy is underrated, or unless we really have him rated high, despite what any kind of recruiting service ranks him. He's just not going to go pick up the number 100 and something offensive lineman out of the state of Texas unless he really thinks he can help him. Right. And so what I think has happened is he's narrowed his focus in state. And so in his eyes, he has managed the state as well as he can. There's a number of guys that he wants in the state that can play for him, and he's either getting them or he's not, but he's not then going to tier 2 just because they're from inside the state. A lot of previous coaches in Texas, well, we're going to recruit the state of Texas, and they easily go to tier 2 really quickly. And Sark's not as willing to do that. And you know what? It's working out for him.
Yeah.
Whether that's because he's winning right now, whether because of it's NIL and the style that he plays, I don't know all of the answers. And I don't think anybody truly does, because it's individual on a player-by-player basis. But the reality of it, if you mix it all together, he's going for 1s and 1As in the state of Texas and not dipping down to 2s. And then instead of worrying about that, he's going for 1s in Georgia and Florida and California.
Well said.
As a mix, And so I think he's fine. I think the idea of signing 25 from the state of Texas is over, because they're not getting those 25. Some of them are going to Ohio State. Some of them are going to Oregon. Some of them are going to OU or LSU or A&M. Some of them are going to Georgia. And so if you give a handful of guys out of that 25 or 30 in the state of Texas that there are, you got to go elsewhere. You got to go elsewhere. So, all right. That's going to do it for this week's State of the Program. I appreciate CJ Vogel for joining us. I also appreciate Adam Lowy and the Lowy Law Firm. If you've been injured in a car wreck, truck wreck, automobile accident of any kind, make sure you give Adam and his firm a call. LowyLawFirm.com. 20 years of experience of helping injured Texans. They aim to do right by their clients. Again, LowyLawFirm.com. CJ, thank you so much, bud. Thanks also to our producer, Matt Hutchinson, and thank you to all of you watching On Texas Football. This has been State of the Program. Hook 'em.